It is on. I see. All right. I think we're going to get started, even though I have a feeling that a few people will dribble in a little bit later. And our speakers need to sit down too. I think we better get started so that we can stay on time. We've got a full hour and a half of fascinating information for you with three wonderful speakers. We're so fortunate. So welcome. Our first speaker, I need to tell you about restrooms. Through that door, the ladies is to the right and the men's to the left. We're not going to take a break. We're going to have three speakers and then a half an hour of question and answer following their presentations. So if you need to leave, leave and come back quietly. Okay. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pamela Karchurin. Pamela received her PhD in Modern and Russian Art from Indiana University. She's been teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in both art history and Slavic studies at Duke University. Is there something wrong? I'm hearing something funny. Well, I'm going to assume that it's okay until Pamela has been teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in both art history and Slavic studies at Duke University since 2007. And she's currently teaching a course called Russian Art and Politics, a couple sections of that, and she taught Soviet art after Stalin last fall. Pamela has 13 years of administrative experience, including 8 years in international education at Harvard and 4 years in undergraduate advising at Duke. She has extensive experience in work study and education abroad programs and is fluent in both Russian and Spanish. Dr. Karchurin has lectured on Smithsonian summer journeys in Russia and consulted with both the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and Sotheby's. Pamela's daughter Haley is with us this afternoon. She's up there with the projection equipment. And Pamela and Haley live with Ernest, Pamela's husband, in Durham. Pamela's topic is up there, and without further ado, please.
Thank you. Is this my my clicker? Oh, good. Okay. All right. So, can everybody hear me? Okay, in here? Okay. So I should just ignore this chatter? Well, I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll do the best we can. That's one of the lessons.
We have one call-in user, not a video, and we're trying to get them to put their hand over their microphone on their phone. We believe it's ambient noise. They're in a public place listening by phone.
Okay, and they're having a conversation there, and we're hearing it.
Okay.
If you were to tell them that, the person with their phone, if they'll put their hand over their phone, Her name is Lundy.
Lundy? Okay. If you could just cover your phone receiver so that we can't hear the ambient noise, that would be perfect.
How do I do that?
Just, oh. Okay.
If somebody has a set of earphones, you could just plug it in here and nobody will hear anything.
Okay.
Okay, well, it's quiet now. So, yeah, don't. I don't know you, but I'm telling you not to talk. Okay, so as you will learn from going to Russia, or as you know, if you have been to Russia, you know that you just do the very best you can with what you have, right? And so, you have to be ready to improvise. And so I think we'll be doing some of that as well. Thank you. Oh, that's good. Thank you. Okay. So today in my Молодец. Молодец. That means good work in Russian. And so today I thought I would just give you a very brief overview of a major theme in Russian art, which is that of the patronage, the the people who are collecting, who are paying for the art, who are buying it, and how the patronage decisions, how the collectors decide about what they're going to buy, is very heavily influenced by the politics of the time and the personal politics of the patrons. And so in Russia, it's very hard, well, it's impossible really to segregate art from politics. They're completely interdependent, completely interwoven, and we'll see how some of that plays out today on a few of the slides. So the art that I'll be discussing today is primarily made in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in the far western sections of Russia. There's here's St. Petersburg, where the Academy of Fine Arts was founded. Moscow, of course, the capital, a great capital of arts and culture. And the rest of the country, of course, they produced a lot of great art as well, but, I only have 20 minutes. So even if we start with the most iconic, if you will, the most recognizable piece of architecture in the country, what is it? St. Basil's Cathedral, yes. St. Basil's Cathedral is a building that, yes, it has a function of a church, but it was built essentially for political reasons. It was built by the very famous Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, and Ivan had this kind of weird career where he was actually Ivan the not that bad until about the second half of his life, his second half of his rule, and then he became really Ivan the Terrible. And it was during this Ivan the not so bad period that he commissioned this church to be built in the most prominent place in Moscow. And it was built not so much to function as a church, although it certainly did, but it was a marker. It was a way of marking a military victory. It was a military victory that Ivan led against the successors to the Mongols. Now, the Mongols had made it all the way to Moscow and even further west into Europe in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. And then they had set up their own cities and civilizations within Russia. And Ivan fought the Mongols, fought the successors to the Mongols until they retreated out of Russia and out of the heartland of what would become the Russian Empire. And for that reason, he built this building. Then he recreated Christ-like rituals that sort of cemented his political position, his political power as the Tsar. So even religion is very tied up with the politics of Russia. And we might hear more about that today, I hope. Okay. So one of the questions that comes up when you study Russian art is, well, who cares? The music is so great. We've all heard of Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff and Shostakovich. I mean, the music is one of those fantastic cultural productions that everybody has to reckon with if you're a music appreciator. The literature, my God, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Solzhenitsyn. I mean, the list goes on, and we'll hear more about that today, I'm sure, from Kurt here. But what about the art? Who cares, right? The art is not that famous. Well, the art is not that important. But actually, art did have a lot of importance in Russia, specifically because it was so tied in with the politics. And when we first see art, kind of visual art, kind of coming to the forefront of Russian culture production, it is around the time of Peter the Great, who ruled Russia, who turned Russia into an empire and died in 1725. But before he died, he imported hundreds of French, Italian, British artists and architects in order to teach Russians how to paint. of course, they knew how to paint. They knew how to paint icons beautifully. They knew how to paint sort of flattened portraits of kings, which is what we have there on the left. And unfortunately, to see this really well, you need lower lights, but we're improvising. But Peter believed that art, that good artistic production is a symbol of sophistication, is a symbol of that Russia is on par with its European counterparts. And so Peter created opportunities for artists to learn how to paint like their European counterparts. And so Peter's daughter actually founded the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts and started churning out artists who were able to take on the great masters of Europe, like Joshua Reynolds, and could even exceed their talent in some cases. So on the left, we have a painting of Madame Lapukhina, a Russian aristocrat from 1797, so the end of the 18th century. I am not going to make you pronounce his name, or should I? Should I make them say it? Okay. Borovikovsky. Very good. The great thing about Russian is it's totally phonetic. You just say those little Slavic letters, and you got it right. Right? So Borovikovsky, what a sadist you are. An excellent example of how the Russians kind of developed this very European-appearing visual language, very European way of painting, and this was a status symbol, so that no longer could the painters in England, such as Joshua Reynolds, turn up their noses at Russian painting. In fact, Russian painting was seen as being on par, and this was very much about Russia's status as a great power, more than just that the paintings could be seen as equally as good. Catherine the Great also used art as a power, something happened with the mic. She also used art as a mode of political power, as a way of expressing her political power. So Catherine, some of you probably already know this, and you'll certainly learn it when you're in Russia. Catherine the Great actively purchased hundreds and hundreds of paintings from the great European collectors, from Frederick the Great of Prussia to French households, aristocratic households. She was just purchasing their art kind of en masse. She didn't even know what she was getting half the time. She was just purchasing it as a way of demonstrating how much money she has, how much political power she has, and the two, of course, go hand in hand. Because if you have a monarch who has access to all these resources, who can build buildings like the Hermitage on the right to house these astounding collections, then she must be very wealthy and indeed have, oh, thank you so much, Carol. That she must be, in fact, controlling huge amounts of resources. And she really wanted to stick it to Frederick the Great of Prussia, because Catherine had led a successful military campaign against Prussia, and Frederick the Great lost the campaign, and Catherine had to exact, war reparations from him, and so Frederick the Great of Prussia, the Emperor of Prussia, was completely broke. And so Catherine said, hey, I'll buy your art collection. So she ended up buying many of the masterpieces that are in the Hermitage now, the Rembrandts, the Jan Steens, Jordans, the Van Dycks, a huge number of the Dutch masters came from Frederick of Prussia, not because she liked Rembrandt. She probably didn't know who he was. But just to show that she had more power than he did and that Russia should be taken seriously as a military power, as a political power, etc. Now, it wasn't just all about the czars. The czars weren't the only people who were buying art. Of course, you have a massive number, the majority of the population of Russia in the 19th century are peasants. So they're not really buying this kind of art. There were crafts and folk art and other things that they could buy. But in terms of paintings, the market widened a bit from just the aristocrats to the rising middle class, the merchant classes, and now they were able to buy paintings. But they also bought paintings with particular political and ideological messages. So, for example, this artist, Venezianov, liked to paint serfs, or they were basically slaves. They were tied to the land, they were owned, they were property, just like in the American context. And he was appealing to people who were landowners. And so rather than showing the kind of, difficulties, the poverty, the disease, the ignorance that a lot of these people, a lot of the serfs lived in, the terrible conditions, he showed them in these absolutely idyllic landscapes at one with the land. Again, it's difficult to see with all these lights on. But the peasant figure that's in the forefront is taking a break. She's beautifully dressed. She's actually nursing a baby. And so there's a heavy identification between her figure of, of the mother and nurturing the child, the same as you would nurture the land, and it's very cyclical. And so Venezianov was appealing to people who really wanted serfdom to continue. There's no political rocking of any boats here. It sort of keeps the status quo in place, which was to keep serfdom in place, and indeed it did stay in place until the early 1860s. Patronage could work in another way as well. It not only served to support the status quo, but it also protected artists. Now, this artist, in this picture in particular, he's got a lot of negativity going on in terms of this subject. It's a monastery meal, but he paints the priests as, completely drunk, falling over, passing out, just gorging themselves on tons of food. This is not what we normally associate with the priesthood, right? There's beggars who have come to the monastery for help. There's this lady here with a baby and a little boy, and they don't have any clothes, and they're very thin. Are they getting any help? No. They're being completely ignored. Here's some wealthy landowners, aristocrats, who are being sort of hosted here, and it's a scene of debauchery, of spiritual breakdown. And had Perov tried to exhibit this, he probably would have been exiled, possibly executed. But a patron, he only had one, but you only need one, bought this and bought everything that this guy painted. So Perov never had to sort of justify his art to the censors. He never had to put up with being exiled or punished in any way, and his patron just was sort of keeping him safe politically. Let's just talk about the guy on the right for the moment, who was another important patron of Russian art, Pavel Tretyakov, self-made man, not an aristocrat, self-made man. He was a specialist in textile mills. He built textile mills and made millions of rubles. And he was also an art collector. And Tretyakov was a staunch Russian nationalist. He was working and living at the time where there was this kind of divide in Russian society. Where is our fate? Is our fate with the Western world, with technological progress, or is our fate just with Russia itself? Should we just continue Russian traditions and reject the West? Something that is very much a conversation today, right? And Tretyakov was a believer that the Russians were totally self-sufficient and that the Western technology, Western politics were foreign to Russia, and he was a real he was a Slavophile. He was a real Russian nationalist. So he would purchase any art that had anything to do with Russia, even if it showed Russia in kind of a bad light. He would buy it. In fact, his slogan was "Buy Russian." You know how sometimes we get a little jingoistic here in the U.S. and we say "Buy American"? Yeah. Well, his slogan was "Buy Russian." And so whatever was painted that was about Russia, he bought. And so even if it showed the peasants or people who had it really bad, we still see that Tretyakov is interested in his art, in the art. So these people are literally, this is like got to be the worst job in the universe, right? They literally are strapping these big leather harnesses over their bodies, and they're human tugboats. They're literally pulling the barge laden with wood up onto the shore. Now, this is a bad job, and it doesn't show Russia as a particularly progressive place. However, Tretyakov didn't mind because it was about Russia. Same with landscapes, same with other pictures in the 19th century that were about Russia. There was an instant patron available to buy their art, and of course artists, pandered to that. And we'll skip. You want me to be done right now? Yeah. Okay. So I'll just finish up here. So as many of you know already, there's this tremendous push right now for Russians to actually buy all the stuff that was sold off after the fall of the Romanov dynasty, all the jewelry, the Fabergé eggs, the paintings, all the decorative arts. So the Russians, who have become wealthy in the post-Soviet era, are actively buying back the eggs and the paintings and the furniture to restore to the country of Russia. Back probably 10 years ago, an oligarch, Viktor Vekselberg, bought directly from Malcolm Forbes these 9 Fabergé eggs for $100 million, and now they're installed in the so-called Fabergé Egg Museum in St. Petersburg. I don't know if that's the official name, but it was a way of bringing Russian art back to Russia. Okay, so I'll end there.
Chance to ask questions and more comments, and we get to that part of the thing. I know it goes entirely too. Introduce our second speaker. I'm on. Thank you so much. Our second speaker is Father Christopher Foley. Father Foley was assigned to Holy Cross, the Orthodox church that serves Greensboro, High Point, and Winston-Salem, with services entirely in English. In May of 2006, he had just graduated from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in Yonkers, New York. He had converted to the Orthodox faith while he was in college. The Mission Church, Holy Cross, leased space at Christ Presbyterian Church in High Point, renovated it, installed an iconostas, and 8 years later, Holy Cross has grown and prospered and is poised to build its own facility in Kernersville. Father Christopher and his wife Carrie live in Greensboro and are parents to 4 sons, one of whom is with us today, also up in the balcony, and his name is? Jonas, that's right, thank you. From travels in Russia during his youth and as a pastor to a number of Slavic people, Father Foley understands how faith is embedded in Russian culture. And he's going to share with us what its current impact might be on those who will be our hosts in Moscow. Father Foley, thank you.
Well, it's great to be here today to talk to you all. I want to ask a question first. If you were like me, growing up not Orthodox, do you know about the Orthodox Church? Did you know that this is a whole kind of third branch of Christianity, if you will, that is different than the Protestant Church, that's different than the Catholic Church? Are you familiar? Have any of you been to an Orthodox church before? A few of you? Greek Orthodox? What, for maybe a funeral or a wedding? Or Right. I know the Greek festival, there's one in Annunciation and Winston at Dormition and Greensboro. Well, I grew up not Orthodox. I had no idea what the Orthodox Church was. I grew up evangelical. I remember going on a mission trip to Russia, and I remember talking to my translator, sitting outside waiting for the bus, and I saw this strange-looking building across the street that looked a lot like St. Basil's Cathedral. And I remember asking the translator, what on earth is that? This onion dome with, stars and stuff on it. So, oh, that's the Orthodox Church. That's the Christianity of our Russian people. And I thought, what? I grew up during the Cold War. All the Russians were godless atheists. But to understand that there has been Christianity in Russia for over 1,000 years. And so it's important to understand that this is why it's so much a part of the Russian soul, is this Christian faith of Orthodoxy. I mean, the Orthodox Church is the predominant religion and Christian faith in Russia. I think the last census was, 350 million Orthodox Christians in Russia. And so as you're going to be going to Russia, it's just important as you stay in people's homes, you're going to see icons in people's homes. They'll have them in each of their rooms. A lot of times they're in a corner. You'll see whenever people cross in front of an icon, you'll see them cross themselves. And this crossing themselves is a little theological story. The 3 fingers are the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The 2 fingers are the belief that Christ is fully God and fully man. And so anytime they cross themselves, they're blessing themselves. They're asking the Lord for a blessing. So you'll see people do that before, a meal. You might find if you're talking to somebody and they're saying something that's just profound or very moving to them, or they're talking about a relative of theirs, you might see them spontaneously cross themselves as they're talking. This is very much a part of the Russian culture. The 2 stories I like to tell about, the history of Russia and the Slavic people is, there's 2 stories. One is there were 2 missionaries, St. Cyril and St. Methodius. They were commissioned to go and bring Christianity to the Slavic peoples. This was before Russia. This was before the nation states. There were just Slavic tribes in what is today Bulgaria. So these missionaries, they went to this people group and they started learning their language. And they realized these people have never had a written language before. So they learned the language, and one of the first things they did is they developed an alphabet for the Slavic people. And so this is why we call this alphabet the Cyrillic alphabet. It's named after St. Cyril. And basically what it is they took the Greek letters from the Greek alphabet and changed them a little bit and matched them to the language that they were learning. And so this is where we today have the Cyrillic alphabet. It was a missionary effort to bring Christianity to the Slavic people. Then much later, 300 or 400 years after that, the story is that there was St. Vladimir. He was the prince in Kiev. This was, again, before the modern state of Russia, really. It was Prince Vladimir. He wanted to bring all of the Slavic tribes together, and he wanted to find a religion for his people. So in the early 10th century, he sent emissaries out all over the world to look at all the different major religions. Sent them to Rome, sent them to Mecca, sent them to Jerusalem, to look at all these different faiths. Well, the emissaries, when they would come back from these various places, would report back to St. Vladimir, Prince Vladimir, what they found. But it wasn't until they visited Constantinople and they visited the Divine Liturgy in Hagia Sophia. This is the quintessential Orthodox church at that time, before the Ottoman Empire, before Istanbul. And they experienced the Divine Liturgy there, the worship of the Orthodox Church. And what they wrote back to Prince Vladimir is, we didn't know whether we were on earth or in heaven, but there we knew that God dwelt with man. And so, based on that report, Prince Vladimir decided to adopt Orthodox Christianity for his people. And so that was in 988. And so that was the beginning of Christianity, really, in what is now known today as Russia. It began in what is now the Ukraine, but spread into the north, into Russia. And so it's very much a part of the culture, in the art and the literature. You just find that so much a part of the Russian soul is this identity of Orthodox Christianity. In the art, the architecture, whether it's good or not, and entwined with the politics as well. The one painting with, the drunk priests. I mean, some of that you can see why there was such dissonance going on in 19th century Russia, and why perhaps when the Bolsheviks came, there was some acceptance of their ideas because, unfortunately, some of the church had, become corrupt at different levels. And so there was this, kind of this reaction against the church. But there has always been a very faithful remnant of, dedicated, Christ-loving Christians in Russia. And after the Bolsheviks took over, many of the churches were closed. They were turned into warehouses, bars, discotheques, all kinds of things. And I think it went from about 60,000 churches and monasteries down to about 1,000. So they were able to show to the West, oh yeah, we still have religious freedom, because they could point to a few churches that were still open. But by and large, the Bolsheviks were really trying to wipe out, any remnant of Christianity. And there was a lot of persecution amongst the clergy, the bishops, a lot of monastics, a lot of people were imprisoned and killed. But when World War II came, well, we need to get behind the church, because if we can give the church a little bit of freedom, then we can get people to get behind the war effort. So there was different times over the 70 years of communism where the church did have a little bit of freedom, but for the most part, it really was suppressed. The interesting thing is that when these churches were closed down, a lot of these faithful Orthodox Russians would go and they would take all the icons out of the churches and all of the holy utensils and everything, because they didn't want that to be confiscated by the Bolsheviks. So after the fall of communism, when these churches were given back to the people, people would come from all parts of the village bringing the icons back, would bring the holy utensils back that they kept. And now there's been this rebirth in Russia of Christianity, of the Christian faith, building of new churches. Young people are coming back to the churches. So you've really seen a rebirth in Russia, of Christianity. I understand you'll be staying in people's homes. Is that correct? So you'll have a lot of chances, I'm sure, to talk with people about their faith. It's so much a part of the fabric of the culture there. I've been over there 3 different times, twice as a Protestant missionary, and then the 3rd time as a visitor, really as a pilgrim. And it is a beautiful, beautiful place. The people are so warm, so inviting. The hospitality is out of this world. They're cooking. You better like vodka because they will offer it to you, and it's a sign of hospitality. Just wonderful, wonderful people. And you'll find that Christianity is definitely a part of, there's a lot of smaller religious groups as well, a lot of Jews there, some Protestant groups as well. But, by and large, the majority of the Christians you will meet in Russia are Orthodox Christians. So I look forward to taking questions later. So thank you very much.
And now our 3rd speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kurt Shaw. Kurt received his PhD in Russian literature from the University of Kansas, and he has taught at Wake Forest for 25 years. He's what? 28, right. You're right. But who's counting, right? And he's an extremely popular professor. Martha's been in his class, and she attests to that too, and you will like hearing from him. Kurt was raised in Maine. He's watched a lot of old movies, and he was an expert at the children's card game Authors. Anybody remember Authors? Fred did, but somewhere along the way, however, he fell under the spell of all things Russian, and that was it. Not only was the language grand and glorious, but the Russian winters reminded me of my childhood in Maine. It was love at first sight, and I've never looked back. Everyone should be so lucky. And we're lucky today because we're going to hear from Dr. Shaw about the titans of Russian literature. And then some.
Is my microphone working? Yeah, I guess it is. Okay. This is my security blanket because there's just so much to talk about. We have up here Alexander Pushkin. Essentially, there are 7 people you cannot do without as far as Russian literature of the 19th century. And so we're going to talk about those guys. If there's any time left, then we'll talk about the 20th century, certainly. Alexander Pushkin, well, there was Russian literature before him, but it tended to be derivative in nature. A lot of it was based on stories from German or French or even English stuff. And it also tended to be heavily laden with older language, okay? The church language, Old Church Slavonic, was used very much. It's sort of like the King James English. And Pushkin was one of these guys who felt that, we really need to clean up the language and get rid of a lot of this, get rid of the foreign expressions, and make Russian really Russian instead of just bits and pieces. So Pushkin is extremely important in terms of making the language more Russian, more capable, an instrument of literary creation. He was a brilliant poet. In fact, the Russians refer to him as basically the Russian Shakespeare. Well, they don't refer to him as that, but he might as well be. They say that when Pushkin, when you recite Pushkin, it's like music. Okay. Pushkin came from the impoverished nobility. He was allowed to go to the special school and to develop all of his various talents. Some things that are very important about Pushkin, aside from his impact on the Russian language and his making it this sort of extremely useful and efficient language for everyone who was to come after him, he brought a number of topics to light which are very important. There's a topic called the superfluous man, which appears over and over again in Russian literature. It happens that there were a lot of young men of good family, okay, who had all of the advantages. They had, their families had money, they had good educations, they were taught piano, they were taught painting, they would go to good schools. But the only thing you could do to serve your country afterwards was either to work in the army or to work in the civil service. you couldn't, in a sense, follow your own muse. And there's this sense, this theory that's sort of become canonical. There's some debate about it. But this idea that these people were superfluous because they had all of the benefits, all of the gifts, but they couldn't really do anything with it. And it presumably created a lot of frustration. Pushkin himself was very frustrated in a number of ways. He found himself in exile quite often. At one point, the Tsar decided his wife was kind of cute and said, I hereby pronounce you the gentleman of the bedchamber so that I can keep tabs on your wife. A rough life. He died very young in a duel. I think he was about 38, thereabouts. His most famous works are Yevgeny Onegin, which is a novel in verse, in which this character is very much one of the first superfluous men, somebody with a lot of money. He falls in love with this girl named Tatiana. Well, doesn't really fall in love with her right away, but he doesn't know what to do with himself. Okay, there are so many avenues, but nothing that's really satisfying. But again, the verse structure is very musical. He's very clever. There are these diversions. Later, when poetry began to wane in the late 1820s and the early 1830s, he switched over to prose, and this is where he really started the ball rolling on, producing this more Russian prose. He started writing a few tales. One is a collection called Tales of Belkin, which is 5 short stories, if you ever get to read it. The stories are not related to each other, but they are clever, very economical in terms of language, and fun stories. There also is kind of a creepy Gothic story called The Queen of Spades, which you might want to look at sometime. And of course, he has a good deal of lyric poetry and is basically the be-all and end-all in Russian literature. Okay, next guy up. Ploof. Nikolai Gogol. Nikolai Gogol had a very long nose, okay, and noses play a big role in his work. Gogol was actually Malorossiyski, which means Little Russian. He was Ukrainian, okay, is where he came from. But the language of education, the language of public discourse was Russian, and so his Russian, of course, was excellent. He was kind of an odd sort of duck. His mother was a bit of a, well, how should I say this? She had very dark versions of religion. Her take on religion was exceptionally strange and often punitive, and she'd often scare her son into being good, by virtue of her sort of take on religion. Anyway, he was phenomenally eloquent. They say that Gogol, when he went to write a story, the weakest thing about it was plot. In fact, his most famous novel, Dead Souls, is a story which was inspired by Pushkin. Pushkin said, you should write a story about this. If you gave him a plot, Gogol all of a sudden would create this dazzling universe of crazy people. He had this sort of fascination for detail. You would always know what everybody's wearing. And he had a sort of sense of the absurd in terms of looking at how people were and what they did and how they used status to sort of put down other people, okay? In Russian life, you had the Table of Ranks, which was instituted by Peter the Great. It went from like 1 to 14. And if you were number 6, well, that was pretty good, but a guy who was number 5 could look down his nose at you, and you would feel every inch a worm. Okay, that's how things were in Russia at that time, or at least in Gogol's imagination, and I think there probably was a grain of truth. He started off writing these very funny, sort of Marx Brothers-esque fairy tales, Ukrainian fairy tales. Very funny. You've got these demons, who are sort of like I don't know, Jimmy Durante or something, they're grouchy and they have to get beat up, to be told, to be persuaded to do something. Later, he went into a series of stories about Petersburg. And there's this whole myth of the city of Petersburg, because as some of you may know, Petersburg was built on a swamp and peasant labor was used, and there are a lot of dead bodies beneath Petersburg. And the suggestion is that the ghosts of dead people, would rise to the surface, and scare you. He wrote a story called The Overcoat, which is probably his most famous story, about a poor clerk named Akaky Akakievich. And Akaky Akakievich doesn't have an overcoat, okay? He's had the same one in Petersburg for 10 years, maybe. It's incredibly cold in Petersburg, and so he figures he's going to economize. He eats like soup, with like nothing in it but water and maybe a piece of hair, maybe a couple of flies for flavor. And eventually he's able to buy this new overcoat. Well, unfortunately, he gets beaten up by a couple of these giant guys out of nowhere who may be part of the Evil Dead, who knows. But there's this myth of Petersburg which he sort of exploited in the overcoat. And also this idea of the poor put upon petty clerk is very much a theme in Russian literature. In fact, Dostoevsky takes it and runs with it. But a very, very important story. The story Dead Souls, which is a novel, there were two parts actually. Everybody reads the first part. Nobody but masochistic religious scholars read, or literary scholars read the second part. But it's about a guy who wants to show that he has enough wealth to marry into a rich family. And to do that, he says, I got a plan. And this guy has been a bureaucrat. He knows all the ins and outs of law. And he goes around into the countryside and says, hey, you know what? The census occurs every 10 years. You have to pay the taxes on your serfs for that 10 years. Let me pay the taxes. I will buy the serfs from you. You won't have to worry. No problems, okay? And by being able to tell somebody, well, I have in my possession 100, 200, 300, 1,000 serfs, that is an indication of your wealth, okay? The guy's a scam artist, okay? He is what they call a picaro. It's a picaresque novel, a rascal novel, okay? But a very, very big deal. And it is what Gogol's fame relies upon. He had a wicked sense of humor. Again, there's, like I said, a lot of Marx Brothers. He has a lot of sight gags. Very different from Pushkin, whose prose is sort of, kind of restrained and sort of classical. Third person I want to mention is Mikhail Lermontov. Mikhail Lermontov is another person who played with the idea of the superfluous man. He was, like Pushkin, a poet, a romantic poet, and he had a lot of problems because he was sort of like, I don't know if you remember this old commercial, right? Robert Conrad, and he's got a battery, and he says, I dare you. Well, this guy was sort of the same way. He basically wanted to take the world on. He was not happy with the world. He did not like Russian society. When we say society, we're talking about high society, what you might call Hollywood society with the balls and the plunging necklines and all of that. Like Pushkin, he came from this background of, these people who had all of the benefits, but, what could you do? He served in the army, and he didn't like it, but there weren't any other outlets. He is interesting because of his narrative innovation. He is most famous for, aside from his lyrical poetry, he is most famous for a novel called A Hero of Our Time, which is about a guy named Pechorin. And Pechorin is a sort of, I don't know, he's somebody who's got a big chip on his shoulder, not unlike Lermontov. And he likes playing head games with people because he can't find a way to be happy, okay? Not given the situation that Russia consists of at this time. And so there are all sorts of tricks he pulls on people. He's been to the parties, he's had all the women he's wanted, he's had money, and none of it seems to do anything, okay? And all that's left is basically to say, hey, hit me, I dare you, okay? So that's the sort of character you have there. He has lots of different chapters from different points of view, and really a remarkable guy, killed in a duel, along with Pushkin. Pushkin was killed in a duel also, I should say, not together. But a fascinating writer. There was, somebody made reference to, Pamela made reference to the conflict between West and East, the Westernizers and the Slavophiles, and that is very important in terms of this next writer, Ivan Turgenev. Poof. Ivan Turgenev, again, came from a noble family. He had a mom who threatened to, basically dispossess him of every penny he ever had if he got out of line. He didn't take out the trash. Well, there goes your fortune. I'm exaggerating, but, she was not a pleasant person. Turgenev was a phenomenal stylist, and the more I read Turgenev, the more I'm amazed at his understanding of psychology, of how people, relate to each other. He also had, they say when he died, they weighed his brain. It was like 20 pounds or something ridiculous, just a really, really bright guy. Turgenev was very instrumental, in a sense, in terms of the abolition of serfdom in 1861 in Russia. He was influenced by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he wrote a number of stories which were collected together in a volume called Notes of a Hunter. And basically he went around hunting, as gentlemen of his class did, and he would meet different people. And when he put this together, you had something of an indictment of the system. I mean, some of the stories were, well, there's one called The Singers, where he goes to hear these peasants have a contest, a singing contest, and he's blown away because it is so beautiful, and he never expected that. Another one, you'll have a story where a guy abuses one of his serfs, but it had a powerful impact on the emancipation movement in Russia. In terms of this superfluous man idea, he wrote a number of novels in which his male characters are very weak, and the female characters are very strong. And again, it's this idea that they have never really had an outlet of their own choosing. At least that's the sort of oversimplified idea. But a couple of novels with those types. But his masterpiece came out in about 1862, if I'm not mistaken. It's called Fathers and Sons, technically Fathers and Children. And it has to do with the clash of the generations between the men of the 1840s, the progressive liberals, who really didn't get a whole lot done, and the new class. There was a new class of people called the raznachinci, people from various classes. All of a sudden, you didn't have to be from a family that was rich or aristocratic or well-connected to be literate. In fact, a lot of these were from priest families. And so you had a lot of these people who all of a sudden came from a completely different background, were calling for, well, we should get rid of all of this stuff here. We've got this terrible government system here. There was a lot of interest in English economic philosophy at the time. Some people would come out and say, well, all this Pushkin, a pair of shoes is more useful than Pushkin. So, let's get shoes and forget about Pushkin. So anyway, this was happening. And in Fathers and Sons, you have this very interesting clash between, again, an uncle and a father, and their son and nephew, respectively, and his guest Bazarov, who is a new man of the 60s, somebody who thinks logically and, thinks love is silly and all this stuff. Very important novel. I want to talk about Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is my favorite novelist. Dostoevsky, basically is concerned with the problems of good and evil, the problem of God, or problems of religion, or of not having God in your life. He is a precursor of existentialism. He was very much admired by people like the German philosopher Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, the French existentialist Albert Camus. And his basic shtick, if I may call it that, is that a society where God did not play a part in everyday life was a society which was headed for destruction. And he saw socialism as the big boogaboo. Boogaboo, is that a word? Bugaboo. Bugaboo. The idea that the socialists were largely atheists who created their own system of values through reason. And Dostoevsky tended to feel that if you don't include God in the equation, then you will have problems. This is precisely what happens to Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He is seduced, if you will, by the ideas that are floating around, and it's only toward the very end of the novel that he starts to get a glimmer of how he's been so wrong. He's also wrote a novel called The Brothers Karamazov. Am I over already? Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Okay. Finish Dostoevsky. Okay. Dostoevsky is extremely important because of his profound psychology. He is a novelist of ideas, okay? As opposed to, just very quickly, Chekhov and Tolstoy. Tolstoy, brilliant stylist. Tolstoy had a fascinating sense of the psychology of people of his own class, okay? I think intellectually, Tolstoy was probably naive. He liked the peasants and the noble savage idea, and felt that society had a tendency to somehow corrupt everybody. Be that as it may, his style is wonderful, his characters are wonderful. Anna Karenina, wonderful novel. War and Peace, except for when he gets on his soapbox, but I will talk about that. Last one I want to talk about is Chekhov. Real quick, Chekhov was from a poor family. He trained as a doctor. He started writing funny stories to support his family, and eventually wound up writing like 400 different stories. Chekhov in this country is known primarily for his plays, which are kind of interesting and strange and hard to read, but his stories are what most Russians know best, and he was extremely important. And I will hush up. If you want to know about the 20th century, take a look.